So I'm just going to talk to you briefly today about multimodal methods in qualitative longitudinal research and their position and the kind of value that I think using different kinds of activity can bring to qualitative longitudinal work. I'm going to talk about it in quite a narrow way, I suppose, today, mainly focusing on images and video, and I'm going to give you some examples of how we're using that in the current qualitative longitudinal project that I work on, and show you what kind of problems and challenges and benefits that we found from doing research in that way. So obviously it's going to cover quite a small proportion of the activities that you could involve in your research, and I just mentioned at this stage that the Timescapes website has a number of resources which consider other activities which I won't be talking about, things like using timelines and visual maps in research and the kind of benefits that can bring. So I just want to quickly talk about why I think multimodal methods are valuable in relation to qualitative longitudinal research, and there are sort of four main issues that I wanted to flag up that I felt were salient. First of all, the issue of sustaining participant engagement. Obviously there's going to be a number of research encounters in a qualitative longitudinal project, so it's both about making the research encounter itself interesting and engaging, so people want to maintain their involvement in the research project, but also maintaining contact in between those moments where you're actually collecting data, and thinking about how you can do that in different ways, and how that might represent a point of data generation or data collection in itself. Second issue is the idea about extending temporal horizons. So because of the central concern about time in qualitative longitudinal research, can we use multimodal methods in ways that help people thinking about their past and their futures? So this is something we've considered a lot in research that we've been doing. A project that Karen and I and Carrie worked on in relation to fatherhood. We were looking at using people's biographical images to help them think about their own past and their own personal futures. So it's relatively straightforward in a lot of cases to get personal images for people to reflect on their own biographical horizons, but we were also interested in thinking about how can we expand that thinking to more talk about wider social issues in relation to past and futures. I'm going to talk about that a bit in a moment. Thirdly, one of the aims of qualitative longitudinal research is to capture the kind of dynamic and changing nature of people's lives. So are different methods better placed to do this? Can we represent that in different ways through image or film? And finally, making the invisible tangible. So we've tried to use visual methods to help people think about issues which they might otherwise find difficult to talk about if asked in a straightforward manner in an interview. So how can we use images and the kind of very salient and particular things that they represent to help people think about things which would otherwise be difficult to talk about if they were just being asked directly? So there are some issues that I think are important to consider when you're using different activities and methods in your research. Are you going to be generating them as a researcher, or are you going to be asking the participant to generate the materials? So if you're asking your participant to create something, whether it be an image or a drawing, is it interesting, is it engaging, how kind of time consuming is that going to be for them? Will participants choose in producing their own materials to put a particular version of themselves forward? So to give you an example of this, in the project that I just mentioned about fatherhood that we worked on, in one of the interviews we asked people to bring family photographs to the interview to have a discussion about. And when we talked about this method at conference, people raised concerns that people were just going to bring happy family pictures, and we were going to get a particular version of family life that, oh, everything's great in my family and this is what I want to represent. And quite a lot of the time we did get pictures which represented happy, but positive versions of family life, but actually that wasn't always what the talk about it were generated. So for example, one man brought a picture with his 3 children stood next to each other, happy and smiling, and he used that as an example to say that was his favourite picture because it was so abnormal, because they were normally fighting and hitting each other. So it's not just about the kind of image or the activity itself, but what else can that generate in the research encounter? if you're generating materials as a researcher, there's issues around what are you kind of imposing on your participants and what framework are you choosing to represent. Secondly, in qualitative longitudinal research, are you going to generate materials within or between the interview encounters? So we've got different opportunities here, and I'll talk a bit about what we've done. But there's opportunities to do things within the encounter and also between as kind of maintaining contact and maintaining interest in the project. Thirdly, there are particular ethical obligations, as I think has been raised already. So if we're using people's personal images or video, how are we dealing with issues around confidentiality and anonymity in relation to that? It adds another layer of complexity into qualitative longitudinal research. And finally, an issue of analysis. So if you're producing these different kinds of materials, are you interested in analysing them of themselves or for the kind of talk they generate? So I'm just going to introduce you to a qualitative longitudinal project that I work on at the moment, which is led by Karen and the other team members I mentioned there. I'm just going to give you a bit of background about the project and then explain how we've used some different activities within it. So the project is called Energy Biographies, and it's concerned with looking about how people use energy in their everyday life and how they develop particular behaviours and habits in relation to energy use. So we're interested in things like how do people do things in a similar or different way to their own parents, and how do things like significant life events like having a child or retiring affect the way people use energy. So we're drawing on experience of using visual methods in previous research projects. We wanted to experiment with using different kinds of visual methods to see how this could help in our research and how this could help address our research objectives. So to explain a bit about the project, we're working in 4 case site areas across the UK. So we've got, within Cardiff, we are working in an affluent commuter village on the outskirts and a deprived inner city ward, which both have interventions around solar panels. The third case site is an eco-village in West Wales, where participants live completely off-grid. They're building their own homes from sustainable materials, and they're earning their living from land-based livelihoods. And finally, we've got a case site which is a large hospital in London, and they have a number of interventions around carbon reduction targets. And so we're interviewing people who are employed at the hospital to consider how some of those messages they receive at work might cross over into their home or vice versa. So in terms of the numbers and what we're doing, we've conducted 68 interviews with 74 people in the first round, so 74 because we did some couple and family interviews. And then we've got a subsample of 36 people within that who then we've interviewed a second and third time, 6 and 12 months after the first interview. So I'm just going to talk to you about some of the activities that we did then in the longitudinal work. So between interviews 1 and 2, we offered participants a camera phone if they wanted to take part long term, which had some logistical issues, which I can talk about. But what we wanted to do at this stage was ask participants to take a picture of things that they felt related to energy use. And we gave them 4 main themes to do this because it was over a sort of several month period. So what we felt is by giving them different themes, things like travel, around the home, we thought that would help to kind of act as a prompt about the activity, as a reminder, and give them something a bit of a refresher, given it was over that sort of period. So at the beginning of each of those periods, we sent a text message reminding them of those themes, asked them to take pictures. So we didn't give them any guidance on numbers of pictures to take, which meant we received between 500 and 400 pictures per person, which was a bit of a challenge in terms of getting through that in the second interview. Because what we did is we didn't ask people to give us back these pictures. We went back to the second interview and we asked them to talk through it at that time, so we were seeing them for the first time in the interview context. So it made it very much more a participant-led interview because they were talking through the images, what they had chosen to take them and what they felt was relevant. So some of the things here, it kind of produced talk that we might not have otherwise have considered within the interviews. So things like about energy-saving messages, sort of washing at 30 instead of 40, and how that affected people's behaviour, crossover between home and work, and the issues of being able to control energy use, and things like efficiency and the importance of efficiency for notions of good energy use. So in that picture at the bottom, they're growing tomatoes and using the heat in their greenhouse to dry their washings at the same time. So that was the activity that we asked them to do between interviews 1 and 2, and then use that to talk about in the second interview. Between interviews 2 and 3, we tried a different kind of image activity, and this time we sent them text messages, so we're using text-prompted photos. So what we did between August and October, there was 10 occasions when we sent a text message to all our participants on the same days and the same times, asking them to take a picture of what they were doing at the time. And we explained to them, obviously, that they didn't have to take pictures including people, but just something to represent the activity that they were engaged in when we asked for those pictures. They then sent the pictures back to us, and we created sort of photo timelines of the 10 occasions when we asked them to take pictures. And a lot of people sent us captions to explain the pictures as well. So that's an example of one of the timelines that we created. We then used the timeline to take back and discuss in the third interview. And the idea about this was A, to get a point of comparison of something that everyone was doing at the same days and times across all our sample groups, and B, to get some of the more mundane aspects of daily life that might not otherwise get talked about. So we used this in the interview to talk about how this was representative of that period of their lives and their routines, what was missing, what was surprising. So we had a lot of talk about how frequently computer screens were represented in people's sort of surprise at how much time they spent at work a lot of the time. So what we also wanted to do with this is use it as a point to help people think about past and futures. So we asked them to think about how their routine and these images might have looked different if we'd asked them to do it a year previously or a year in the future. How would they like things to be different? What would they like to change? Or what did they anticipate might be different? And we then used them to ask longer term futures, sort of 10 years or 15 years in the future. How would you like the images and what's represented to look different? So this sort of helped in those longer term thinkings because people had something concrete to talk about, so saying things like, I don't want to be using my car to commute an hour to work every day in a year's time or 10 years' time. So it helped provide a sort of anchor for those different temporal points. So the final activity was during the third interview. So within this interview, we wanted to think about the future, both personal futures and wider social futures. We showed our participants 2 videos. We've got 2 different representations of the future here. The first is from the 1950s. It was a house which was part of a Disneyland exhibit called Tomorrowland. So it was represented as a house of the future in 1957, I think. In addition to talking about the content and things that were represented, all the forms of technology, we had a lot of talk about the film itself and the very gendered representation of family life that was there, and the music and the voiceover, and how much a product of its time it was. The second set of clips that we showed people from a 2012 vision of the future. So what we did was showed these clips to participants and then asked for their reflections on it, what they liked, what they didn't like, what was surprising. And we use it to talk about what they might like to see in an alternative vision of the future. So having this very kind of tangential representation of the future helped people think more about what they would like to see in both their own and wider social futures. So there's a lot of criticism about the amount of technology and the reliance on technology and electricity that was in these images. So I've just put a couple of quotes up there to show you how people were thinking more widely about past and futures. So Susanna in that 1950s video was thinking about how it was a product of its time in terms of coming from a period of war and deprivation to a more optimistic vision of abundance and a comfortable and easy life. And Dennis, in thinking about that Aero Garden clip, most people really hated that and wouldn't like that in their own homes, but he was thinking about the potential relevance of that in terms of predictions for population growth and the need to feed people and longer term trends in terms of wider social issues. So I would say that this was really productive for us in terms of thinking about talk about the futures. We had during the interviews, it produced around 45 minutes plus of talk, so it was quite a substantial proportion of the time, and it really helped people think about these past and futures. So just want to conclude about a couple of thoughts from using these different techniques. The first one, where we asked people to take images of things that they felt were relevant, was really good for having a participant-led discussion, for people to be able to raise issues that they felt were important that we might not otherwise have covered. The main issue was the amount of variation we had, as I said, between 500 and 400, so we had quite a substantial amount. I think we've got about 2,000 pictures so far just from that task. So there's quite a substantial amount of data that produced. The text prompted pictures were really useful for us, having a fairly large sample and providing a direct point of comparison, and also as a kind of very tangential point of reference in thinking about these different past and futures and what people would like to see similarly or differently. The main issue with that was technological issues, people not receiving the messages, people having trouble sending them back, and we have varying levels of technological skill in our sample. And finally, the videos I think were really good for these temporal extensions and thinking about past and futures and expanding that beyond the biographical to thinking about wider issues. I suppose one point with that is there is this issue of the researcher framing, and that we chose those videos and we're giving them a particular representation of future life, but people did use that in a way that they were happy to disagree. In fact, most people disagreed and disliked what they saw represented, and used that as a platform to then voice their own thoughts about what they would like to see in the future. So finally, I just want to end by saying that I think using these different techniques really helped to enhance the richness of our data and really help to maintain people's interest in the project by engaging them in all these different techniques.